The hangar smelled like cold metal and old hydraulic fluid, the kind of scent that clung to a man's clothes long after the shift ended. Garrett Hawthorne pushed the wide dust mop across the polished concrete floor, its yellow fibers collecting bits of wire insulation and flecks of aluminum shavings that sparkled under the overhead sodium lights. The clock on the far wall read 5:47 a.m., and the world outside the massive steel doors was still dark Dallas morning traffic just beginning its crawl along the interstate half a mile away. This was the rhythm Garrett knew best now. Arrive before the technicians, before the engineers with their coffee cups and their clipboards, before the executives in their German sedans. Unlock the side entrance with the key that hung on a simple ring alongside his apartment fob and the mailbox key. Flip the breaker switches in sequence. Watch the fluorescent banks stutter to life across 30,000 square feet of workspace. Begin the sweep from the north corner, methodical rows overlapping strokes the way his father had taught him to mow a lawn back in Ohio when lawns still mattered and fathers still taught. In the small office alcove near the parts storage, Cole Hawthorne slept in the old vinyl chair Garrett had dragged in from the surplus pile. The boy's head tilted against the cracked headrest, his jacket bunched under one cheek, his breathing soft and even. 9 years old, and already learning the shape of his father's world, the pre-dawn starts and the quiet hours before the noise began. Garrett paused his work to adjust the jacket, tucking it more securely beneath Cole's head without waking him. The boy stirred slightly, murmured something unintelligible, then settled again. Garrett returned to the floor, guiding the mop between the landing gear of the Gulfstream G650 that dominated the center bay. Sovereign 1, they called it. $65 million of composite fuselage and turbofan thrust the flagship of Sterling Aerospace's executive charter fleet. He'd cleaned around this aircraft 40 times in the past 6 months, knew every rivet line and panel seam, every access door and inspection port. His eyes tracked the hydraulic lines running beneath the belly cowling, followed them up to the primary valve cluster just aft of the nose wheel well. That faint discoloration along the forward mounting bracket had it been there yesterday. He stopped, set the mop aside, crouched low to examine the metal surface. A thin film of fluid, barely visible, traced the edge of the bracket where it met the fuselage frame. His fingertip came away slick. He smelled it, then wiped his hand on the rag tucked in his belt. Hydraulic fluid, type 4, the high-temperature synthetic they used in the G650's primary flight control system. The weep was minimal, probably less than a teaspoon over the past 24 hours, but weeps didn't stay minimal. Metal under thermal stress didn't heal itself. It cracked slowly at first, then catastrophically when the load became too great. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up his face in the dim hangar. Open the maintenance app. Sterling required all employees to use even janitors, even though most of his submissions vanished into whatever digital void the system maintained for non-technical staff. He typed slowly, using the precise language he'd learned 15 years ago in another life. Sovereign 1 primary hydraulic system. Observed fluid seepage, forward mounting bracket valve cluster Charlie 7. Coloration and viscosity consistent with thermal degradation. Recommend immediate manual inspection of primary flow regulator housing. Potential pre-failure thermal warping. Flight operations should be suspended pending physical verification of structural integrity. He submitted the report. The app thanked him with a cheerful green checkmark and a message. Your observation has been logged for review by authorized personnel. Garrett pocketed the phone, picked up his mop, kept working. In 6 months, he'd submitted 47 similar reports. He knew exactly how many, because he kept his own log, a simple spiral notebook in his locker, dates and details, and the nothing that came after. The system didn't reject his submissions. It simply filed them somewhere beneath the threshold of anyone's attention. The hangar's main lights blazed on at 6:15, the big switches throwing with a heavy mechanical clunk that echoed through the space. Garrett glanced toward the office alcove. Cole sat up, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up on one side. The boy found his backpack on the floor, pulled out a drawing pad and a set of colored pencils. He'd been sketching aircraft for the past year, page after page of jets and helicopters, fuselages, and tail assemblies, each one labeled in careful block letters with the make and model. The current page showed a Gulfstream viewed from a 3/4 angle, the proportions remarkably accurate for a 9-year-old working from memory and observation. Garrett moved his cleaning cart to the southern section of the hangar where the parts benches stood in neat rows. He emptied the trash bins, wiped down the work surfaces, checked the recycling containers for anything that didn't belong. A crumpled energy bar wrapper, 2 crushed soda cans, a zip tie someone had cut too short and discarded. He collected them all, maintained the order that let other people do their jobs without thinking about the small details. That was the work now. Not the throttle and stick, not the pre-flight checklist and the tower clearance, not the moment of rotation when the nose wheel lifted and the earth released its hold. Just the mop and the trash cart and the quiet satisfaction of a clean floor. The first technicians arrived at 6:45, 3 men in company coveralls carrying toolboxes and tablets. They nodded at Garrett without really seeing him, the way people nodded at furniture or walls, acknowledging presence without registering identity. One of them made a joke about the Cowboys game. Another laughed, the third one just grunted and headed for the coffee station in the break room. Garrett kept his head down, pushed the cart toward the tool crib, began organizing the cleaning supplies for the day shift that would take over at 2 p.m. Cole appeared at his elbow, backpack slung over one shoulder. The school bus stop was 3 blocks away, a corner where 6 other kids gathered each morning at 7:10. Garrett walked his son there every day, stood with him until the bus arrived, watched until the yellow vehicle turned the corner, and disappeared. This morning, Cole was quiet, his usual stream of questions about airplanes and engines replaced by a heaviness Garrett recognized but couldn't quite reach. At the corner, Cole finally spoke, his voice smaller than it should have been. "I told them you were a maintenance supervisor." Garrett felt the words land, felt the weight of what they carried. He knelt down, bringing himself level with his son's eyes. "Cole, I'm a janitor. There's no shame in that. I keep the place running, same as anyone else." The boy's face tightened, fighting something Garrett couldn't fight for him. "They called you the floor guy. Said their dads make real money." The yellow bus rounded the corner 2 blocks away, its brake lights flashing red at each stop sign. Garrett gripped Cole's shoulder, not hard, just enough to anchor the moment. Real money doesn't make real men. Remember that. The work you do with your hands, the care you put into it, that's what counts. Those kids don't know what I know, and that's fine. But you know, that's what matters. Cole nodded, not quite convinced, but holding on to the words like a rope thrown across dark water. The bus hissed to a stop, its doors folding open. Cole climbed the steps, found a seat near the back, pressed his face against the window. Garrett raised one hand. Cole raised his back. Then the bus pulled away, and Garrett was alone on the corner, watching until the yellow paint disappeared into the morning haze. He walked back to Sterling Aerospace, swiped his badge at the employee entrance, returned to the hangar. The place had come alive in his absence, 15 people now moving through the space with purpose and urgency. Near Sovereign 1, a cluster of engineers stood in a tight circle, their voices carrying across the concrete in sharp fragments of technical jargon and frustration. Garrett angled his cart toward the break room, giving them space, but his ears tracked every word. Pressure fluctuation in the primary hydraulic system. The diagnostic software flagged it at 0400 hours, but the parameters are within nominal range. Could be a sensor drift, could be a calibration error in the data acquisition unit. That was Brendan Walsh, 28 years old, MIT graduate, 2 years at Sterling, and certain of everything. He held a tablet in front of him like a shield, the screen filled with graphs and readouts that glowed with clean digital authority. Run the sensor diagnostic again. If it comes back clean, we reboot the primary flight control computer and reset the baseline. It's probably just accumulated noise in the signal processing. Dr. Russell Bennett stood slightly apart from the younger engineers. His arms crossed, his expression neutral, but his eyes focused on something the others weren't seeing. Russell had been at Sterling for 23 years, had worked his way up from apprentice mechanic to chief engineer through sheer persistence and a refusal to trust numbers that didn't match his instincts. He was old enough to remember when aircraft were maintained by feel as much as by computer, when a man could put his hand on an engine cowling and know whether the beast inside was happy or hungry. Russell spoke without looking at the tablet. Did anyone physically inspect the valve assembly? Not the sensors, the actual hardware. Brendan barely glanced up from his screen. The telemetry is clear, Dr. Bennett. If there was a physical fault, the system would show it. That's literally what these instruments are designed to detect. Russell's jaw tightened, but he didn't push. Garrett recognized that look, had seen it on his own face in the mirror when he'd stopped arguing and started accepting. He wheeled his cart past them close enough to hear, but not close enough to intrude his presence as invisible as the floor he'd just cleaned. A black sedan pulled up to the hangar's main entrance, its engine so quiet it barely registered over the background noise of compressed air tools and rolling equipment carts. The driver's door opened, and Victoria Ashford stepped out, her posture straight and deliberate, her expression carved from something harder than the concrete beneath her shoes. She wore a dark suit that probably cost more than Garrett's monthly rent, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested control and competence, and no patience for complications. She walked directly to the engineering cluster, her heels clicking sharp notes against the floor. Everyone straightened slightly, a reflexive response to authority that needed no announcement. Status report, 2 minutes or less. Brendan launched into an explanation heavy with technical terminology and light on certainty. Victoria listened without interrupting, her eyes moving from the tablet screen to the aircraft and back again. When Brendan finished, she turned to Russell. Do we fly or do we ground, Russell? Hesitated, and in that hesitation, Garrett heard the same doubt that had been nagging at him since he'd seen the fluid weep. The data says we fly, but data isn't always the whole story. Victoria's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. I have 73 minutes to be in Zurich. $400 million depends on me physically sitting across from Heinrich Volker and signing papers. This aircraft is scheduled wheels up in 40 minutes. If you can't give me certainty one way or the other, I need a decision that keeps me on schedule. Russell looked at the aircraft, then at Brendan, then back at Victoria. We'll run one more diagnostic cycle. If it comes back clean, we fly. Victoria nodded once, already turning toward her assistant, who hovered nearby with a briefcase and an anxious expression. She moved away from the group, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and clipped as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. Garrett watched her pace a tight circle near the hangar's south wall, her free hand gesturing in sharp movements that betrayed the calm her face refused to show. He pushed his cart toward the parts storage area, but his path took him within 20 feet of where she stood. Her voice carried just enough for him to catch fragments. "Don't care what the board thinks. We're not postponing, as I understand the risk, but the risk of not closing is worse. Find me a backup option if this falls through, but I'm planning on wheels up in 35 minutes. She ended the call, turned, and found herself looking directly at Garrett. Her gaze passed over him the way it might pass over a forklift or a storage rack, acknowledging presence without assigning value. Then she spoke not to him, but to her assistant who had followed her across the hangar. 4 years at MIT, 2 more at Stanford, and these people can't tell me if a machine works. Maybe we should ask the janitor. He probably has a better instinct than $1 million worth of engineering degrees." The assistant laughed a nervous sound that died quickly in the cavernous space. Victoria didn't laugh. She was already walking back toward the engineering cluster, her attention shifted to whatever problem required solving next. Garrett stood motionless beside his cart, the mop handle gripped in one hand, the words settling into his chest like stones dropped into deep water. He'd heard worse. Had heard it in the Navy when the officers forgot the enlisted men, had heard it in job interviews, when hiring managers looked at his resume gap and made assumptions about capability and commitment. Words were just air-shaped by lips and teeth, and a man could let them pass through him without leaving marks if he practiced enough. But Cole had heard words like these. Would hear them again probably today, definitely tomorrow. Would carry them the way Garrett now carried this moment, a weight that accumulated one conversation at a time until a boy started believing the story other people told about his father. He released the mop, walked quietly to the Sovereign One's nose wheel, well crouched low, where the mounting bracket showed its thin film of seeping fluid. He pulled a small flashlight from his belt, the kind he used to check dark corners for trash, and angled the beam along the valve housing. The metal surface showed discoloration consistent with repeated thermal cycling, the kind of stress that happened when a component was working harder than designed, compensating for a failure somewhere else in the system. He traced the hydraulic line back to the primary manifold, noting the faint vibration he could feel through his fingertips when he touched the line. Not the steady pulse of normal flow, but an irregular flutter, the machine's way of saying something was wrong in a language most people had forgotten how to hear. He took out his phone again, opened the maintenance app, typed a second report. Sovereign 1 follow-up. Physical inspection confirms thermal stress on primary flow regulator. Discoloration and vibration pattern consistent with imminent structural failure. Hydraulic system will likely experience catastrophic pump seizure under sustained high thrust conditions. Recommend immediate grounding and manual valve replacement before flight operations resume. Failure probability at V1 rotation speed 87%. He submitted the report. The green check mark appeared. The cheerful message thanked him for his diligence. Somewhere in the system's database, his words joined the other 47 warnings that had accumulated like unread letters in a dead man's mailbox. Garrett stood pocketed, his phone returned to his cart. The engineers were still clustered around their tablets, running their diagnostics, watching their screens paint pictures of a reality that didn't quite match the machine in front of them. Russell stood apart, his arms still crossed, his doubt visible in the tension of his shoulders. Victoria paced near the hangar entrance, her phone once again pressed to her ear, her voice rising just enough to carry an edge of desperation wrapped in corporate authority. The diagnostic cycle completed. Brendan looked up from his tablet relief, flooding his expression. All parameters nominal. Pressure within acceptable variance. System shows ready for flight operations. Russell frowned, but didn't argue. Victoria ended her call, walked over, looked at Brendan with the kind of focus that demanded simple answers to complicated questions. "We're clear," Brendan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. All systems green. Sovereign 1 is flight ready." Victoria turned to her assistant. "Get the pilot. We're leaving in 20 minutes. She walked toward the aircraft stairs, her movement confident the problem solved by the certainty of men with degrees from schools that taught them everything except how to trust their instincts over their instruments. Garrett watched Russell's face, saw the older man's internal struggle play out in the tightening around his eyes, the way his hands flexed once before he shoved them into his pockets. Russell knew something was wrong. But knowing and proving were different countries, and the border between them required evidence that screens and sensors couldn't provide when they'd been calibrated to ignore analog truth. The maintenance crew rolled the portable stairs up to Sovereign One's main door. Victoria climbed them without hesitation, disappeared into the aircraft's leather and wood interior. Her assistant followed, then two other executives. Garrett didn't recognize their faces, tight with the kind of stress that came from riding in a machine they didn't understand, trusting their lives to systems they couldn't see. The engines would start in 10 minutes. The taxi would take another 5. Then the long runway stretched the throttle advancement, the point of no return, when the aircraft reached V1 speed, and the pilot's only option was to commit to flight or die trying to stop. At that moment, when every system was pushed to maximum demand, when the hydraulic pump screamed with the load of raising gear and pressurizing control surfaces, when thermal stress peaked and metal decided whether to hold or fail, that was when Garrett's report would stop being words on a screen and become physics written in wreckage and bodies. He couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't let it happen. But the shape of his intervention remained unclear, the path forward blocked by the simple fact that nobody in this hangar would listen to a man who pushed a mop and emptied trash cans. The pilot arrived, a professional Garrett vaguely recognized from previous charters, a man in his 50s with 20,000 flight hours and the calm demeanor of someone who'd survived enough close calls to respect the machine without fearing it. He walked directly to the aircraft, climbed the stairs, disappeared inside. The whine of the auxiliary power unit starting up echoed through the hangar, that distinctive high-pitched spin that signaled the beginning of the pre-flight sequence. Brendan and two other engineers walked around the aircraft one final time, checking access panels, verifying seals, giving the visual inspection that regulations required, even when screens said everything was perfect. They moved with the efficiency of people following a checklist, seeing what they expected to see, confirming what they already believed. Brendan passed within 6 feet of the nose wheel, glanced at the valve housing, saw nothing that his training had taught him to recognize as a problem. Garrett gripped his mop handle, the wood, smooth beneath his palm from years of use. He could walk away, finish his shift, pick up Cole from school, make dinner in their small apartment, watch his son do homework at the kitchen table. He could let other people make their own decisions, live with their own consequences, trust in systems and credentials and the accumulated weight of institutional authority. Or he could step forward, cross the invisible line that separated his world from theirs, speak words that would either save lives or destroy whatever small dignity he'd managed to preserve in this place. The engines began their start sequence, one turbine spinning up with a rising howl that filled the hangar with sound and fury. Garrett set down his mop, walked toward the engineering cluster where Russell stood alone, watching the aircraft with an expression that mirrored Garrett's own internal calculation. He stopped 3 feet from Russell, close enough to be heard over the engine noise, far enough to respect the boundary between their positions. "Dr. Bennett, the valve housing shows thermal stress. There's fluid seepage on the forward bracket. I filed 2 reports this morning." Russell turned his eyes, taking in Garrett fully for the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in 6 months. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something that might have been hope or might have been suspicion. "You filed reports," were the maintenance app, both before Euro 600. Detailed observations, including failure probability calculations. Russell pulled out his tablet, opened the maintenance system, began scrolling through logs. His fingers moved faster as he searched, his frown deepening. He looked up at Garrett. "There's nothing here under your name, no submissions at all." Garrett had expected this, had known it was coming, but the confirmation still landed with weight. "The system archives non-technical staff submissions. I've been filing reports for 6 months. 47 total. All of them flagged potential issues. None of them were ever reviewed." Russell's face changed anger, replacing confusion, directed not at Garrett, but at the system they both served in different capacities. "What did you see on this aircraft, specifically?" Garrett told him, using the language he'd learned in another life, the precise technical vocabulary of hydraulic systems and thermal stress analysis and failure mode prediction. He described the discoloration pattern, the vibration signature, the fluid viscosity, and seepage rate. He gave numbers and probabilities, and the exact point in the flight envelope where the system would transition from stressed to failed. Russell listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each sentence. When Garrett finished, Russell asked the question that mattered. "How do you know all this?" The second engine started its spin-up sequence, adding another layer of noise to the hangar's acoustic chaos. Garrett looked at the aircraft, at the machine he knew better than he knew most people at the systems he'd helped design 15 years ago, when he'd been someone else. "I used to test fly these aircraft. Before I had a son who needed a father more than the Navy needed a pilot." Russell stared at him, processing, calculating, weighing the impossible claim against the detailed knowledge Garrett had just demonstrated. The older engineer pulled out his phone, stepped away from the noise, made a call. Garrett watched him talk to someone, saw Russell's expression shift from skepticism to shock, to something that looked like anger mixed with vindication. Russell ended the call, walked back, looked at Garrett with new eyes. Captain Garrett Hawthorne, Naval Test Pilot School Class of 2009, lead test pilot for the G650 prototype program, 3,840 flight hours, Distinguished Flying Cross for bringing home a damaged F-18 Super Hornet that should have killed you. You disappeared from military aviation 7 years ago. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew where. Garrett nodded once the acknowledgement simple and complete. My son was 2. His mother left. He needed me present, not deployed. So I stopped flying and started being a father. The aircraft's engines reached idle power, their combined roar making conversation difficult. Through the cockpit windows, Garrett could see the pilot running his pre-taxi checklist, his hands moving over switches and controls with practiced efficiency. The ground crew pulled away, the stairs disconnected, the external power gave the all-clear signal. Russell's voice cut through the noise. "Can you fix this right now before they taxi?" Garrett shook his head. "Not without authorization. Not without tools and access. But I can prove I'm right if someone will listen." Russell turned toward Victoria, who stood 20 feet away, talking to Brendan, her expression impatient and fixed. Russell started walking toward her, Garrett following 3 steps behind. They reached the group just as Victoria was ending another phone call, her face showing the strain of too many variables and not enough certainty. Russell spoke before anyone else could. "Miss Ashford, we have a problem. This aircraft is not safe to fly." Victoria's attention snapped to Russell like a blade finding its target. "Your engineer just cleared it. All diagnostics green." What changed in the last 3 minutes? Russell gestured toward Garrett. "This man filed 2 detailed reports this morning flagging a critical hydraulic system fault. The system archived them because he's classified as non-technical staff. But he's not non-technical. He's Victoria." Cut him off, her voice rising to match her mounting frustration. "I don't care if he's the Pope. I care if my aircraft is safe to fly. Brendan, run the diagnostic again. Right now." Brendan's fingers moved across his tablet, pulling up screens and initiating sequences. The results came back within 90 seconds. He looked up, confidence intact. "All parameters nominal, Miss Ashford." Whatever this person thinks, he saw the instruments disagree. Victoria turned her full attention to Garrett for the first time that morning. Her eyes moved from his sterling aerospace janitor's uniform to his face, taking in the quiet certainty they're measuring him against some internal standard that probably included degrees and credentials and professional affiliations he no longer possessed. "You're the janitor, the one who cleans the floors." Garrett met her gaze, his voice calm and level, despite the engines screaming behind him. "I'm also the man who knows this aircraft will experience catastrophic hydraulic failure at V1 rotation speed. The primary flow regulator is thermally compromised. Under sustained high-thrust load, the pump will seize. You'll lose all hydraulic pressure. No control surfaces, no brakes, no steering. The aircraft will be uncontrollable. Everyone aboard will die." The words hung in the space between them, stark and unavoidable. Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog, landing finally on something that looked like anger wrapped around fear. "Brendan, get the pilot on the radio. Tell him to shut down and return to the ramp." Brendan moved quickly, speaking into his radio, relaying the message. Through the cockpit windows, Garrett saw the pilot's head turn, saw him acknowledge the instruction, saw his hands move to begin the shutdown sequence. The engine noise dropped the turbines, spooling down with a descending whine that felt like pressure releasing from a too-tight container. Victoria stepped closer to Garrett, her voice dropping to something cold and sharp. "If you're wrong about this, if you just cost me $400 million, because you think you know something these engineers don't, I will make sure you never work in aviation again. Anywhere. Ever." Garrett held her gaze, his voice steady. "If I'm wrong, you can destroy whatever's left of my career. But if I'm right, you'll be alive to do it." Victoria turned to Russell. "Get a team on that valve assembly. Physical inspection, not screens. I want confirmation one way or the other in 30 minutes. She pulled out her phone, walked away from the group, her posture rigid with the effort of controlling whatever storm was building inside her. Garrett watched her make another call, probably to Zurich, probably explaining a delay she didn't fully understand to people who measured success in minutes and contracts. Russell moved close enough that his next words were meant for Garrett alone. "If you're right about this, you just saved a lot of lives. But I need to know, why didn't you push harder? Why wait until the last minute?" Garrett looked at the aircraft, at the machine he'd tried to protect from afar through reports nobody read and warnings nobody heard. "I pushed 47 times before today. The system Didn't care. Nobody cared. I'm just the man who cleans the floors. That was made very clear to me, repeatedly. Russell's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Brendan approached with 2 other engineers, all of them carrying toolboxes and inspection equipment. They moved to the nose wheel, began the process of accessing the valve assembly Garrett had flagged. Garrett watched them work, saw them find the access panel, remove the cover shine lights into the compartment where hydraulic lines converged in a complex web of metal and rubber. One of the engineers, a woman in her 30s with grease already on her hands from previous work, leaned in close to examine something. She pulled back, looked at Russell, her expression grave. "Dr. Bennett, you need to see this." Russell joined her, looked where she was pointing, then straightened and pulled out his phone. He took several photos, then walked directly to Victoria, interrupting whatever conversation she was having with her assistant. "Miss Ashford." Victoria turned her expression, demanding quick answers to complicated questions. Russell held up his phone, showing her the photos he'd just taken. The valve housing shows advanced thermal stress fracturing. The mounting bracket has micro cracks consistent with imminent structural failure. If this aircraft had taken off and reached full thrust, the system would have failed exactly as described. Catastrophic loss of hydraulic pressure, no control authority, unsurvivable. The words landed in the space between them with the weight of near-miss tragedy. Victoria's face went pale, then flushed emotions cycling too fast for her to fully process any single one. She looked at the aircraft, at the ground crew still standing nearby, at the executives who'd climbed back down the stairs, and now stood in a confused cluster near the hangar entrance. She turned to Garrett, her eyes sharp and searching. You knew this, how Garrett considered several possible answers settled on the simplest truth. I spent 15 years learning how to listen to machines. They tell you when they're hurting if you know how to hear them. Your engineers are excellent at reading screens, but screens only show what sensors detect, and sensors don't feel vibration or smell thermal degradation or see stress patterns that develop between inspection intervals. I do this every morning. I put my hands on these aircraft. I notice things. Victoria absorbed this. Her expression unreadable. Then she did something Garrett hadn't expected. She walked directly to where the executives stood waiting for explanation or instruction or some return to the normal order of things. She spoke to them quietly, her words not carrying across the hangar floor. They nodded, looked toward Garrett, then walked back toward the office section of the building. Victoria returned to where Garrett stood with Russell. I need this aircraft operational. I need to be in Zurich. What's the fix, and how long? Russell looked at the exposed valve assembly, calculating. Replace the entire housing, new seals, pressure test the system. 6 hours minimum, probably 8 to do it right. Victoria's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her jaw tightening, then looked back at Russell. Do it. I'll reschedule Zurich. And I want every archived report from this man reviewed by someone who understands what they're reading. She turned to Garrett one final time. Thank you for speaking up. Even though I made it clear I didn't want to hear it. She walked away before Garrett could respond, her heels clicking across the concrete toward the office wing, her phone already back at her ear, her voice rising and falling with whatever negotiation or explanation was required to salvage a $400 million deal from the wreckage of a grounded aircraft. Russell stood beside Garrett watching her go. That's the closest thing to an apology you'll get from her. She doesn't apologize. She just adjusts and moves forward. Garrett picked up his mop, began pushing his cart toward the break room where the cleaning supplies were stored. I don't need apologies. I just need people to listen when machines talk. Russell followed him a few steps. Captain Hawthorne, just Garrett. I'm not a captain anymore. Haven't been for 7 years. Garrett, that database search I ran, the one that pulled up your record, it also pulled up something else. You didn't just test fly G650s. You helped design the hydraulic systems on the prototype. You wrote half the technical specifications these engineers are following. You're the reason they know what nominal parameters look like. Garrett kept pushing his cart, the wheels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. That was a different life, different priorities. I made my choice when Cole was born. No regrets. But you still have the knowledge, still have the instincts, and clearly you still care enough about these machines to protect them even when nobody's listening. Garrett stopped, turned to face Russell. I care about people not dying in machines I understand better than most. That's not complicated. Russell nodded, started to say something else, then stopped himself. He extended his hand. Garrett shook it, the grip firm and brief. Thank you. For being stubborn. For not giving up after 47 ignored reports. For pushing at the end when it mattered most. Garrett released the handshake, resumed his route to the break room. Behind him, Russell returned to the valve assembly where his team was already removing components, photographing everything, documenting the failure that hadn't happened because one man had refused to accept invisibility as permanent condition. The rest of the shift passed in mechanical routine. Garrett cleaned the break room, emptied the trash, wiped down counters and tables. He swept the office wing, vacuumed the conference room, organized the supply closet. At 2:00 p.m., the day shift janitor arrived, a man named Thomas, who'd worked at Sterling for 12 years and had stories about every executive and engineer who'd passed through these doors. They exchanged brief words about what needed attention, where supplies were running low, which areas required extra focus. Thomas noticed something different in Garrett's expression, but didn't ask. They existed in parallel worlds, visible to each other, but invisible to most everyone else. Garrett clocked out, changed from his coveralls into the jeans and flannel shirt he'd worn that morning. He drove his 15-year-old Ford pickup to Cole's school, arrived 20 minutes before dismissal, parked in the usual spot beneath the oak tree that lost its leaves every November and grew them back every March. Other parents arrived in newer vehicles, SUVs, and sedans that cost more than Garrett earned in 3 years. He didn't envy them. Envy was a luxury. He couldn't afford a distraction from the work of being present. The dismissal bell rang. Children poured from the double doors in waves of noise and motion backpacks, bouncing voices calling to friends and parents. Cole emerged in the second wave, walking alone, his eyes scanning the parking lot until they found the familiar truck. His face changed when he saw Garrett, some of the weight lifting from his shoulders, some of the protection dropping from around his heart. Cole climbed into the passenger seat, dropped his backpack between his feet. "How was your day?" "Fine. Just fine." "Yeah?" Garrett pulled out of the parking lot, headed toward the apartment complex where they'd lived since Cole was 6. The drive took 12 minutes in afternoon traffic, enough time for silence to settle between them or for words to bridge the gap if either of them could find the right ones. Cole finally spoke his voice, careful and small. "Did something happen today at work?" Garrett considered how much to share, how much a 9-year-old could carry, how much truth served growth versus burden. "I stopped an airplane from crashing. Probably saved some lives." Cole turned in his seat, his eyes wide and uncertain, not sure if this was real or some story his father was telling for reasons he didn't understand. Really, really. The machine was sick and nobody else noticed, but I did. So I spoke up. Did they listen? Eventually. After it almost didn't matter. They reached the apartment complex, parked in the numbered spot assigned to their unit. Garrett turned off the engine but didn't move to open his door. Cole didn't move either. They sat in the cab of the old truck, the afternoon sun filtering through the dusty windshield, the world outside continuing its motion while they remained still. "Dad, are you really just a janitor?" Garrett looked at his son, at the question that carried so much weight beneath its simple words. "I'm a father who cleans floors so I can be home when you need me." That's more important than any title. Titles don't make a man, Cole. What he does when nobody's watching, that's what makes him. How he treats people who can't do anything for him, that's what counts. I clean floors with the same care I used to fly airplanes, because the work matters and the people matter, and I won't do anything halfway just because someone else doesn't see the value. Cole nodded slowly, taking in the words, testing them against his own experience, measuring them against the voices at school that said other things. The kids at school, they don't understand. No, they don't. And that's okay. You don't need them to understand. You just need to know the truth yourself. Carry it with you. Let it make you strong instead of making you small. They climbed out of the truck, gathered backpacks and lunchboxes, walked up the concrete stairs to the second-floor unit that was home. Inside, Garrett made sandwiches while Cole spread homework across the kitchen table. Math problems and vocabulary lists, spelling words, and a social studies worksheet about Texas history. Normal afternoon routine, the rhythm they'd established through 7 years of single-parent navigation. Garrett's phone buzzed, a text message from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. Captain Hawthorne. "This is Russell Bennett. Victoria wants to meet with you tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. her office. She has questions. I think you should come." Garrett stared at the message, weighing what it might mean, what complications it might introduce, what changes it might force into the careful balance he'd constructed. He typed a brief reply. "I'll be there." He set down his phone, looked at Cole, bent over his homework, his pencil moving in careful strokes across the page. Whatever tomorrow brought whoever Victoria Ashford was beneath her corporate armor, whatever questions she might ask about his past or his present, none of it mattered more than this moment, this table, this boy who needed a father more than the world needed another pilot. The sun dropped toward the Dallas horizon, painting the apartment walls in shades of amber and gold. Garrett checked Cole's math, listened to him read aloud from his vocabulary list, praised his spelling, and corrected his mistakes with patience born from practice. They ate dinner together, washed dishes side by side, watched an hour of television that didn't require thought or emotional investment. At 8:30, Cole brushed his teeth, put on pajamas, climbed into bed. Garrett sat on the edge of the mattress the way he did every night, waiting for whatever words Cole needed to say before sleep claimed him. "Dad, tomorrow, when you meet with that boss lady." "Are you going to go back to being a pilot?" Garrett smoothed his son's hair, the gesture automatic and ancient, every father's hand knowing the same motion since the first parent comforted the first child. "I'm going to answer her questions. That's all. Nothing changes unless we both want it to change." Cole's eyes were already heavy, his body surrendering to exhaustion, even as his mind tried to hold on to one more moment of wakefulness. "I want you to be happy, Dad, even if it means you're not always here." Something tightened in Garrett's throat, that particular knot that only parents knew, woven from love and sacrifice, and the impossible hope of being enough for someone who deserved everything. "I'm happy right here, buddy. Right where I am. Sleep now." Cole's breathing deepened, his face relaxing into the peace that only children and the truly innocent could access. Garrett sat watching him for another 5 minutes, memorizing this moment the way he'd memorized hundreds of others, building a library of nights when nothing went wrong and nobody needed saving, and the world reduced itself to just this room and this boy and this quiet. He stood, turned off the lamp, left the door cracked exactly 3 inches, the way Cole preferred. In the living room, he sat in the old recliner they'd bought from Goodwill, pulled out his phone, stared at Russell's message. Tomorrow would bring questions he'd spent 7 years avoiding, would bring attention he deliberately left behind, would bring the possibility of becoming visible again in ways that might help or might hurt, might protect or might expose, might strengthen or might shatter. The careful world he'd built from the pieces of a broken career and a failed marriage. But tonight, Cole slept safe in the next room. Tonight, an airplane sat grounded in a hangar because someone had listened. Tonight, people who might have died would go home to their families unaware of the disaster that hadn't found them. That was enough. That had to be enough. Garrett closed his eyes, let exhaustion pull him down toward sleep, carried his son's words with him into the dark. "I want you to be happy, Dad." He was trying. In his own way, with the tools he had left in the life he'd chosen, over the one that once defined him, he was trying. The drive to Sterling Aerospace started at 5:45 a.m. earlier than usual. The Dallas streets still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. Garrett had woken at 4:30, showered, dressed in the cleanest jeans he owned and a button-down shirt he saved for parent-teacher conferences and the occasional job interview that never went anywhere. He'd made breakfast for Cole explain that today might run longer than normal, arranged for the neighbor Mrs. Chen to walk Cole to the bus stop. The boy had asked no questions, just nodded with the understanding of someone who'd learned early that life required flexibility and trust. Victoria Ashford's office occupied the entire northeast corner of Sterling Aerospace's executive wing floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view of the runways and the warehouse district beyond. Garrett arrived at 6:52, waited in the reception area with its leather chairs and aviation photography covering walls painted in corporate gray. A receptionist who looked barely out of college offered coffee. He declined. Russell Bennett emerged from a side corridor at 6:58, nodded once, gestured toward the heavy oak door that led to Victoria's domain. She stood behind her desk when they entered, her posture military straight, her expression unreadable. The office smelled faintly of coffee and paper and something chemical Garrett couldn't identify. Maybe furniture polish or carpet cleaner. Behind her, the windows framed the hangar where Sovereign 1 sat, grounded, its engines silent, its systems being methodically disassembled by technicians who now understood what failure looked like up close. Victoria gestured toward the 2 chairs facing her desk. "Sit." Garrett sat. Russell took the chair beside him, his presence somewhere between ally and observer. Victoria remained standing, her hands flat on the desk surface. Her weight distributed like someone preparing to launch into motion or defend against attack. "I spent 4 hours yesterday on phone calls, rescheduling meetings, explaining delays, managing board members who wanted to know why our flagship aircraft was grounded based on a janitor's observation. Do you know what that kind of conversation costs? Not just in credibility, but in actual contract penalties and lost opportunities." Garrett met her gaze, his voice level. "Less than a crash would have cost. In every currency that matters." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she didn't break eye contact. "Russell showed me your service record. Naval Test Pilot School, top of your class. Lead test pilot for the G650 prototype program. 3,840 hours of flight time, most of it in experimental aircraft that were actively trying to kill you. Distinguished Flying Cross for bringing home a damaged Super Hornet with hydraulic failure and no tail control. You were on track to command your own test squadron, and then you vanished. No retirement, no transition to civilian aviation, no consulting gigs with defense contractors. You just disappeared and showed up here pushing a mop. Garrett said nothing let her work through whatever calculation she was running. Why? Why walk away from that career? Why take a job cleaning floors when you could have written your own ticket anywhere in the aerospace industry? My son was 2 years old. His mother left. He needed a parent who was present, not deployed 8 months a year, testing aircraft in Nevada or Virginia or wherever the Navy needed bodies. I made a choice. I chose him. Victoria absorbed this, her expression shifting in subtle ways that suggested the answer wasn't what she'd expected. You gave up everything for a child. I gave up a career for my son. Those aren't the same thing. She finally sat down, her posture losing some of its rigid control. She opened a folder on her desk, pulled out several printed pages. These are your maintenance reports, all 47 of them. Russell pulled them from the archive system yesterday after we confirmed you were right about the hydraulic failure. Do you know what I found when I read them? Garrett waited. 15 critical issues that our engineering team missed or classified as acceptable risk. 8 safety concerns that would have resulted in minor incidents or major accidents depending on flight conditions. 3 instances where you identified design flaws that shouldn't exist in aircraft that cost $65 million. And all of it written in technical language more precise than most of my engineers use, filed at hours when you were supposed to be cleaning floors, ignored by a system that categorizes janitors as non-technical staff. She spread the reports across her desk, her fingers tapping one in particular. This one from 3 months ago. You identified a potential fuel system crossfeed valve issue that could have resulted in asymmetric fuel distribution during long-range flights. We had an aircraft return early from a Tokyo charter 2 weeks later with exactly that problem. The crew reported it as a minor inconvenience. You predicted it 90 days in advance, and nobody listened. Russell leaned forward slightly. The system is designed to filter submissions by credential level. It's meant to prevent information overload, make sure engineers aren't drowning in reports from people who don't understand what they're observing. But it also creates blind spots when someone who does understand gets categorized incorrectly. Victoria looked at Garrett, something like anger and respect competing for space in her expression. Why didn't you push harder? Why let your reports disappear into some database nobody checks? Garrett considered the question, the assumptions behind it. The worldview that imagined pushing harder was always an option available to everyone equally. I pushed exactly as hard as the system allowed. I filed detailed reports using the only channel available to me. I documented everything I observed. When that didn't work, I tried talking to technicians directly. They were polite and dismissed me. I tried talking to junior engineers. They told me to file reports through proper channels. I did what a man in my position could do without getting fired for overstepping boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross. And yesterday, what changed? Yesterday, people were about to die in a machine. I understand better than anyone in this building. That changes the calculation. Getting fired matters less than letting preventable disaster happen. Victoria stood again, walked to the windows, looked out at the hangar where her aircraft sat wounded and exposed. The board wants to know if you're an asset or a liability. They want to know if hiring a test pilot as a janitor represents gross mismanagement of human resources or if keeping you in that role after yesterday represents gross negligence. They want answers I don't have. She turned back to face him. So I'm asking you directly, what do you want? What would it take to get you back in aviation in a capacity that actually uses your skills instead of wasting them on floors that any high school kid could clean? Garrett felt the question land, felt the weight of what she was offering and what she was assuming about his priorities. He glanced at Russell, who watched with an expression that suggested he'd already run this conversation through several possible outcomes and was curious which one would manifest. I don't want to fly. I gave that up for reasons that still matter. But I could consult. Advisory role reviewing maintenance protocols, training engineers to recognize analog indicators that digital systems miss. Flexible schedule, nothing that conflicts with Cole's school or requires travel. I report to Dr. Bennett, not executive management. No spotlight, no public role, just technical work that keeps people safe. Victoria crossed her arms, her posture defensive against something Garrett couldn't identify. That's it. That's all you want. You could ask for 6 figures, a VP title, your own department. You could leverage yesterday into a complete career resurrection. But you're asking for a part-time consulting role that lets you keep being a janitor. I'm not asking to keep being a janitor. I'm asking for work that matters without consuming my life. Cole is 9. In 9 years, he'll be gone building his own life. I'm not missing these years for any job, no matter how prestigious or well-paid. After he's grown, we can renegotiate. Until then, my terms are non-negotiable. Russell spoke for the first time since they'd entered the office. Victoria. This is exactly what we need. Someone who understands these aircraft at a fundamental level, who can bridge the gap between theoretical engineering and practical operation, who doesn't have ego invested in being right because he's already proven everything he needed to prove in his previous career. Garrett's not looking for glory. He's looking for purpose that fits his life. That makes him more valuable, not less. Victoria returned to her desk, sat down, pulled out a legal pad and a pen that probably cost more than Garrett spent on groceries in a month. Advisory consultant. 15 hours a week, flexible scheduling. You review maintenance protocols. Trained staff have veto authority on flight operations if you identify safety concerns. You report to Russell, but have direct access to me if something critical emerges. Starting salary $75,000 annually prorated for part-time status. Garrett did the math quickly. $75,000 for 15 hours a week was nearly triple what he made cleaning floors full-time. That's too much. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. You're negotiating your salary down. I'm saying the number doesn't match the work. Pay me what the work is worth, not what you think will make me grateful enough to stay. $40,000. That's fair for 15 hours a week of technical consulting. Victoria wrote something on her legal pad, her pen moving in sharp strokes. $60,000. Because the work is worth more than you think it is, and because I'm not going to lose you to some competitor who recognizes your value and pays accordingly. Also, full benefits. Health insurance, dental vision. College savings plan for Cole. Take it, or I start adding zeros until you have to say yes. Garrett felt something shift in his chest, some equation rebalancing between what he could provide and what his son might need. I'll take it, with one additional condition. Victoria waited. Cole comes to work with me sometimes. Not every day, but when school is out or when he needs to see what his father actually does. I'm not hiding this part of my life from him anymore. He needs to understand that the work matters, that his father isn't just cleaning floors because that's all he can do. Victoria nodded once, agreed. Russell, draft the paperwork. I want Garrett officially on staff by end of business today. She stood, extended her hand across the desk. Garrett shook it, her grip firm and brief, the gesture carrying weight beyond simple business courtesy. Thank you for yesterday. For not walking away when it would have been easier. For pushing when nobody wanted to hear it. You saved lives, including mine. I won't forget that. She released his hand, turned to Russell. Take him to HR. Get him set up. Then bring him back to the hangar. I want him to walk the engineering team through exactly what he saw and how he identified the failure before it happened. If we're going to avoid this situation in the future, everyone needs to learn what he knows. Russell stood, gestured toward the door. Garrett followed him out the heavy oak, closing behind them with a solid thunk that sounded like a door sealing on one life and opening onto another. They walked through corridors Garrett had cleaned dozens of times, past offices where executives made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. Russell maintained his silence until they reached the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor where human resources occupied a suite of cubicles and conference rooms. She likes you. Victoria doesn't show gratitude, often doesn't admit when she's wrong, doesn't negotiate with people she considers beneath her institutional level. The fact that she met with you at all, let alone offered you a position that actually uses your expertise, that's significant. Garrett watched the floor numbers descend on the digital display above the doors. She's scared. Yesterday showed her that systems she trusted aren't sufficient, that the people she pays to keep her safe missed something fundamental. Fear makes people reconsider their assumptions. Fear also makes people defensive and irrational. Victoria chose humble. That's rare in this building. The elevator doors opened onto a corridor that led to HR. Russell guided him to a conference room where a woman in her 40s sat surrounded by forms and folders and a laptop that hummed with quiet electronic persistence. Miranda, this is Garrett Hawthorne. Victoria wants him processed for an advisory consultant position by end of day. Full benefits, package, flexible part-time schedule, reporting to me. Whatever paperwork needs to happen, make it happen. Miranda looked at Garrett with the practiced assessment of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of employees and could spot complications before they manifested. I'll need your previous employment records, references, standard background check authorization. If you've held a security clearance that simplifies some of the verification process. Garrett pulled out his wallet, extracted his driver's license, and the military ID card he'd kept, despite no longer having active status. Top secret clearance expired 7 years ago, but should still be in the system. Naval service record under the same name. I can provide references from former commanding officers if you need them. Miranda took the cards, began typing into her laptop, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this particular dance too many times to require conscious thought. This will take a few hours. I'll call you when the paperwork is ready for signature. Dr. Bennett, you can take him back to the hangar. I'll send a runner when we're ready. They left her to her forms, and databases took the elevator back up to ground level, walked across the access road that separated the administrative building from the maintenance hangar. Morning sun painted the concrete in shades of gold and gray, the Texas heat already building toward another day, where triple digits would be normal and air conditioning would be survival rather than comfort. Inside the hangar, Sovereign One dominated the central bay, its cowlings open like surgical wounds, exposing the mechanical anatomy beneath. 3 technicians worked on the hydraulic system, their hands deep in the machine's interior, their tools spread across rolling carts in organized chaos. Nearby, a cluster of engineers stood around a large monitor displaying technical schematics and diagnostic data. Their conversation a mix of technical jargon and frustrated uncertainty. Brendan Walsh stood at the center of the group, his tablet in hand, his expression carrying the weight of someone whose confidence had been shaken and not yet rebuilt. He looked up as Russell and Garrett approached, his eyes tracking Garrett with something between respect and wariness. Russell addressed the group without preamble. "Everyone, this is Captain Garrett Hawthorne. As of today, he's our senior advisory consultant for flight safety and maintenance protocols. Yesterday, he identified a critical hydraulic failure that our diagnostic systems missed. Today, he's going to walk us through exactly how he spotted it and what we need to change in our procedures to make sure we don't miss the next one." 8 sets of eyes focused on Garrett, measuring him against their expectations, comparing the man in front of them to whatever story they'd heard or conclusions they'd drawn. He recognized the look, had seen it on the faces of junior pilots when he'd corrected their technique, on the faces of engineers when he'd challenged their calculations, on the faces of commanders when he'd brought damaged aircraft home through methods that violated doctrine but preserved life. Garrett walked to the exposed hydraulic assembly, the one that had nearly killed everyone aboard Sovereign 1. He pointed to the valve housing its surface, now clearly showing the thermal stress patterns that had been subtle yesterday but were obvious today once you knew what to look for. This housing is made from aluminum alloy 7075T6, chosen for its strength-to-weight ratio and thermal properties. Under normal operation, it maintains temperature equilibrium through convective cooling and hydraulic fluid circulation. When the system starts working harder than designed, compensating for a restriction somewhere else in the line dealing with contaminated fluid that increases friction, fighting against a valve that's binding intermittently, the housing temperature rises. Not enough to trigger thermal sensors which are calibrated for catastrophic overheating, but enough to cause microscopic structural changes in the metal. He traced his finger along the discoloration pattern that marked the housing's surface. This darkening isn't dirt or corrosion, it's oxidation from repeated thermal cycling beyond the designed envelope. The metal is stressed. If you look here under magnification, you'd find microfractures starting to propagate through the grain structure. Another 10 hours of operation, maybe 20 at reduced power, and this housing would have failed completely. The failure mode would be sudden and total. One moment you have hydraulic pressure. The next moment you don't. No warnings, no gradual degradation, just instant loss of system integrity. Brendan stepped closer, his tablet forgotten, his attention fully engaged with what Garrett was describing. But our sensors showed normal pressure throughout the system. How do we detect something the instruments can't see? Garrett straightened, looked at the young engineer with an expression that carried no judgment, just the patience of someone who'd learned these lessons through harder methods than lectures. Your instruments measure what they're designed to measure. Pressure, temperature, flow rate, all within specified parameters. But machines communicate in other languages too. Sound vibrations, smell the way components feel under your hand when you touch them. This valve assembly, if you'd put your hand on it during operation, would have felt wrong. Not hot enough to burn, but warmer than it should be. If you'd listened to the pump during startup, you would have heard a slight irregularity in its rhythm, a hesitation that shouldn't be there. If you'd smelled the hydraulic fluid on this seepage here, he pointed to the bracket where fluid had wept slowly over days. You would have noticed it was slightly degraded, the additives breaking down from excessive heat. Another engineer, a woman named Sarah, whom Garrett recognized from previous mornings in the hangar, spoke up. So we're supposed to touch every component, listen to every sound, smell every fluid. That's not practical for a facility this size with dozens of aircraft on rotating schedules. Garrett nodded. You're right. You can't personally inspect everything, but you can train your people to recognize patterns. You can create protocols that flag combinations of small anomalies that individually seem insignificant but collectively indicate emerging failure. You can weight human observation higher in your decision matrix instead of treating it as noise to be filtered out. He looked at Russell, then back at the group. I filed 47 reports over 6 months. All of them documented observations like this one. Small indicators that something was trending toward failure. Your system archived them because I didn't have the right credentials. If even one of those reports had been reviewed by someone who understood what I was describing, you would have caught patterns. You would have identified aircraft that needed attention before they became safety risks. Russell pulled out his tablet, opened a file, projected it onto the large monitor where everyone could see. These are Garrett's reports organized by aircraft and system. I spent 3 hours last night cross-referencing them with our maintenance records and incident reports. Garrett predicted 15 issues that later manifested as actual problems. 8 of them resulted in minor incidents that were classified as operator error or acceptable system behavior. 3 of them are design flaws that we still haven't addressed across the fleet. If we'd listened to these reports when they were filed, we would have prevented incidents, improved safety margins, and probably saved significant money in reactive maintenance costs. Brendan stared at the monitor, his expression cycling through emotions too quickly to catalog. He turned to Garrett. I dismissed you yesterday. Thought you were overstepping trying to sound important by contradicting people who actually understand these systems. I was wrong. Not just about yesterday, but about what understanding actually means. Garrett met the young man's eyes, saw genuine humility there, the kind that came from having certainty shattered and choosing to learn from the experience rather than defending against it. You weren't wrong to trust your instruments. You were wrong to trust only your instruments. Digital systems are powerful tools, but they're tools, not truth. The truth is in the machine itself, in the physical reality of metal and fluid, and the laws of physics that don't care about our sensors or our confidence. He moved to the next section of the hydraulic assembly, where lines converged in a complex manifold that distributed pressure to various control surfaces. This manifold, if you look at the mounting points, shows where patterns that indicate vibration outside normal parameters. That vibration is caused by turbulent flow, which is caused by a restriction somewhere upstream. If you trace the line back, he followed the hydraulic tubing with his finger, you'll find a filter housing that's probably 80% clogged. Not enough to trigger flow rate alarms, but enough to force the pump to work harder, which generates heat, which stresses the valve housing we just discussed. Sarah moved closer, pulled out her phone, took photos of what Garrett was indicating. How did you know to look for this? What made you check the filter housing? I didn't check it, not physically, but I heard the pump strain during startup yesterday morning. Heard a frequency change in the whine that suggested increased load. That led me to consider flow restrictions. The valve housing's thermal stress confirmed that the pump had been working too hard for too long. The filter was the logical culprit. He looked at the assembled engineers, saw them starting to understand what he was trying to teach. Every system tells a story. Your job is to learn the language well enough that you can read the story before it reaches the final chapter. Instruments give you vocabulary. But fluency comes from time spent with the machine, from paying attention to details that seem insignificant, from building a relationship with the equipment where you know what normal looks like well enough to recognize when something shifts. Russell checked his watch, then addressed the group. We're going to implement new protocols based on what Garrett just described. Starting next week, every aircraft gets a manual inspection before flight operations. Not just a walk-around, but a detailed physical assessment by someone trained to recognize analog indicators. Garrett will develop the training program. Everyone in this room will complete it. This is non-negotiable. If you want to work on aircraft at Sterling Aerospace, you learn to listen to machines the way Captain Hawthorne does. The group nodded, some eagerly, some reluctantly, all of them understanding that the institutional reality had shifted, and their choice was to adapt or become obsolete. Garrett spent the next hour walking them through additional examples, pointing out wear patterns and stress indicators and the subtle signs that machinery used to communicate its condition to any one patient enough to pay attention. He answered questions, clarified technical points, demonstrated how to interpret vibration and sound, and the tactile feedback that came from touching components during operation. At 10:30, a runner from HR arrived with a folder thick with paperwork. Garrett excused himself, followed the runner back to the administrative building, spent 90 minutes signing forms and providing information and submitting to a background check that would verify what Russell and Victoria already knew. By noon, he was officially employed as Senior Advisory Consultant for Flight Safety, his salary and benefits documented in contracts that felt surreal compared to the janitorial timesheets he'd been filling out for 6 months. He returned to the hangar to find Russell in conversation with Victoria near Sovereign One. They both turned as he approached, their expressions carrying news he couldn't quite read. Victoria spoke first. The board reviewed your hire. They're concerned about liability, about what it means to have someone with your background working part-time without direct executive oversight. They want assurances that you're not going to identify problems and then disappear, leaving us exposed. Garrett kept his voice neutral. What kind of assurances? She pulled out her phone, showed him an email that had been forwarded through several layers of corporate hierarchy. They want you to sign an agreement that any safety concerns you identify get reported immediately to both Russell and myself. They want documentation protocols that create a clear chain of accountability, and they want monthly reports summarizing your observations and recommendations. Garrett considered this, looking for the trap or the burden or the complication that would make the work impossible. That's reasonable. I can do that. Victoria seemed surprised by his easy acceptance. No pushback. No concerns about bureaucracy or oversight. You're asking me to do what I've been trying to do for 6 months. Document problems, ensure they get reviewed by people with authority to act, create records that prevent issues from disappearing. That's not bureaucracy. That's how systems work when they're designed correctly. Russell smiled, a slight expression that suggested satisfaction. The board also wants to know if you'd be willing to review our entire maintenance program. All aircraft, all protocols, comprehensive assessment of where we have gaps between digital monitoring and physical reality. They're calling it the Hawthorne Audit. 3 months full access to records and aircraft final report with recommendations. They'll pay you separately for the project on top of your consulting retainer. Garrett felt the scope of what they were describing, the hours it would require, the impact on the schedule he'd carefully constructed around Cole's needs. How many hours are we talking? Russell pulled out his tablet, showed Garrett a project outline that someone had already drafted. Estimated 200 hours over 3 months. You control the schedule work when you can coordinate with me on access to aircraft and personnel. We're not expecting 40-hour weeks. We're expecting thoroughness whenever you have time to provide it. Garrett did the math. 200 hours across, 12 weeks was roughly 17 hours a week, barely more than his consulting agreement already specified. If he could front-load some of the work during summer break when Cole was out of school, it was manageable. I'll do it, but I need flexibility. Some weeks I'll give you 30 hours, some weeks I'll give you 5. The total will hit 200, but the distribution has to work around my son's schedule. Victoria nodded. Agreed. Russell will be your primary contact. I want monthly updates, just high-level summaries of what you're finding. The board wants the detailed report at the end, but I want to know earlier if you identify anything critical that requires immediate action. She extended her hand again. Garrett shook it, the gesture feeling less formal than their morning meeting, more like equals, acknowledging a shared purpose. Welcome back to aviation, Captain. Even if it's not the way you left it. She walked away, her heels clicking against concrete, her phone already at her ear dealing with whatever crisis or opportunity demanded her attention next. Russell waited until she was out of earshot. She's grateful, more than she's showing. Yesterday scared her in ways she won't admit publicly. The idea that she almost died because systems she trusted failed, that frightens her more than losing money or contracts. You gave her back some measure of control. That matters to her. Garrett watched Victoria's retreating form, her posture rigid with the effort of maintaining authority while processing vulnerability. She's strong, but strength without flexibility breaks under enough pressure. She'll need to learn that eventually. Russell's expression suggested he'd had similar thoughts, but lacked the standing to voice them. Come on, I'll show you your workspace. It's not much, but it's yours. They walked to the far corner of the hangar where a small office had been carved out of storage space. 10 by 12 feet, one desk, 2 chairs, a computer that looked reasonably modern, and a window that overlooked the maintenance floor. Sparse, functional, and separate enough from executive oversight to provide independence without isolation. Garrett stood in the doorway, taking in the space that represented more than just square footage and furniture. This was territory, was acknowledgement, was the physical manifestation of being seen again after years of deliberate invisibility. It's perfect. Russell handed him a key card. Badge access works 24 hours. You come and go as your schedule allows. Computer login credentials are in the envelope on the desk. You'll need to set up your own password. IT will contact you about software access and database permissions. He paused, his expression shifting to something more personal. Garrett, I've been at Sterling 23 years. I've seen a lot of talented people come through these doors, but I've never seen anyone with your combination of technical knowledge and practical wisdom. Yesterday, you saved lives, but more than that, you reminded all of us what expertise actually looks like. Not credentials on a wall or degrees from prestigious schools, but deep understanding earned through experience and maintained through care. Thank you for that reminder. Garrett felt the weight of the words, the genuine respect behind them. I didn't do anything special, Russell. I just paid attention. That should be normal, not exceptional. But it is exceptional. That's the problem we're trying to solve. You're going to help us make attention to detail normal again, make caring about the machine's health as important as trusting the diagnostic readout. That's valuable work. Russell left him alone in the small office. Garrett sat in the chair, tested its adjustment, found it comfortable enough. He opened the envelope, found his login credentials, a temporary password he'd need to change, and a welcome memo from IT explaining network policies and data security protocols. His phone buzzed. A text from Cole's school, automated reminder about the parent-teacher conference scheduled for next week. Life continuing its forward motion, regardless of the changes happening in this corner of Dallas, regardless of titles gained or identities reclaimed. He pulled out his own notebook, the spiral-bound pad where he'd been recording observations for 6 months, flipped through pages of technical notes and maintenance concerns, and the careful documentation of patterns he'd seen developing across Sterling's fleet. This data would form the foundation of the Hawthorne audit, would become the baseline against which future performance could be measured. But first, he needed to pick up Cole from school. Needed to explain what had changed today, what it might mean for their routine, how the man who cleaned floors had become the man who kept aircraft safe without abandoning the priorities that mattered most. He locked the office, walked across the hangar floor where technicians were reassembling Sovereign One's hydraulic system. The valve housing had been replaced, the filter cleaned, the mounting points reinforced. The aircraft would fly again, better than before, safer because someone had listened when the machine whispered its distress. Outside, the Dallas afternoon blazed with unforgiving heat. Garrett climbed into his old pickup, started the engine, felt the familiar vibration through the steering wheel. This machine was getting old too, showing its own stress patterns, communicating its own needs through sounds and sensations most people would ignore. He made a mental note to check the transmission fluid, inspect the brake lines, give the truck the same attention he gave the aircraft. Everything deserved care. Everything had value if you were willing to see it. The drive to Cole's school took 15 minutes through traffic that moved with the chaotic determination of a city too big for its infrastructure. Garrett parked in his usual spot, arrived 10 minutes early, used the time to organize his thoughts about how to explain the day's events. When Cole emerged from the school doors, his face carried a brightness that hadn't been there yesterday. He climbed into the truck, dropped his backpack, looked at his father with an expression that contained questions and hope and the careful vulnerability of someone afraid to want too much. Did something happen? You're wearing your good shirt. Garrett pulled out of the parking lot, headed toward home. I got a different job. Still at Sterling, but not cleaning floors anymore. They hired me to keep aircraft safe, to teach engineers how to listen to machines, to make sure what almost happened yesterday doesn't happen again. Cole processed this, his 9-year-old mind working through implications and possibilities. So you're like a pilot again, not a pilot. A consultant. Someone who uses what I learned as a pilot to help other people do their jobs better. It's part-time flexible hours, so I'll still be here when you need me. But it's work that matters. Work that uses what I know instead of hiding it. Cole's smile started small, then grew until it transformed his entire face. Can I tell the kids at school that you're not just a janitor? Garrett pulled into their apartment complex, parked in their assigned spot, turned to face his son fully. You can tell them whatever you want. But remember what I said yesterday. My value didn't change between when I was cleaning floors and when I started consulting. The work is different. The pay is better. The respect from other people might shift. But I'm the same person. The only thing that changed is other people finally see what you've known all along. Cole nodded, holding on to the words, testing them against the reality he'd been living in, where his father's worth was questioned daily by peers who measured value in dollars and titles. They climbed the stairs to their apartment, the familiar rhythm of afternoon routine reasserting itself. Homework spread across the kitchen table, snacks retrieved from the refrigerator, the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. Garrett's phone buzzed. An email from Russell with attachments, the project outline for the Hawthorne audit preliminary schedules and aircraft assignments, and the scope of work that would occupy the next 3 months. Another email arrived, this one from Victoria's assistant, confirming his attendance at a board meeting next month, where he'd present preliminary findings and answer questions about the safety protocols being implemented across the fleet. A third email from HR containing his benefits enrollment forms and reminders about deadlines for health insurance elections and retirement account contributions. The digital avalanche of corporate machinery welcoming him back into systems he'd left behind, offering security and structure, and the complex web of policies that came with being officially employed at a level that mattered. He set down his phone, looked at Cole working through math problems with the focused determination of someone who took school seriously even when it was hard. Watched his son's pencil move across the page, erasing and correcting and refusing to give up until the problem yielded its solution. This was what mattered. This moment, this table, this boy who needed a father, present and engaged and uncompromised by the demands of a career that could easily consume everything if allowed. The work at Sterling was important. Lives depended on it. Safety margins relied on it. Aircraft needed the attention only someone with his experience could provide. But Cole needed him more, would always need him more. And the balance between those two truths required constant navigation, required saying no to opportunities that looked attractive but demanded too much, required protecting the space where father and son could exist without the weight of the world pressing down. Evening settled over Dallas, the sun dropping toward the horizon in shades of orange and red that painted the apartment walls with temporary beauty. Garrett made dinner simple food that required no elaborate preparation. They ate together, washed dishes. Together, moved through the routines that had become ritual through years of practice. At bedtime, Cole asked the question Garrett had been expecting since the afternoon. "Dad, are we going to be okay with money and everything?" Garrett sat on the edge of his son's bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. "We're going to be better than okay. The new job pays enough that we'll have breathing room. Maybe we can fix the truck properly instead of patching it. Maybe we can take a weekend trip somewhere this summer. Nothing extravagant, but more than we've had lately." Cole's eyes reflected the lamplight, showing relief mixed with something that looked like guilt. "I'm glad you got the job, but I would have been okay if you didn't. Just so you know." Garrett felt his chest tighten, felt the pure love of a child who'd learned too early that life required compromise and sacrifice. "I know, buddy, and that's why you're my priority. Because you understand what matters, and you don't demand more than is reasonable, and you make me want to be better than I am." He kissed his son's forehead, turned off the lamp, left the door cracked exactly 3 inches. In the living room, he settled into his chair, pulled out his notebook, began sketching the framework for the Hawthorne audit. 47 reports to analyze patterns, to identify recommendations, to formulate. Maintenance protocols, to review training programs, to develop safety margins, to calculate and verify. 3 months of work that would reshape how Sterling Aerospace approached aircraft maintenance, would potentially save lives that would never know they'd been saved, would create systems that valued attention and care as much as they valued efficiency and profit. But tonight, all he needed to do was outline the beginning. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks, its own challenges, its own opportunities to prove that expertise earned through dedication was worth more than credentials granted through institutions. He wrote steadily for an hour, filling pages with technical notes and procedural frameworks and the methodical documentation of a mind trained to think in systems and solutions. When fatigue finally pulled at his attention, he closed the notebook, set it aside, let his eyes drift shut. Tomorrow would come early, would bring Cole's breakfast and the school bus stop and the drive to Sterling, where his small office waited with its computer and window and the promise of work that mattered. Would bring questions from engineers and systems to inspect in the slow, methodical process of teaching people to see what he saw, hear what he heard, care about machines the way machines deserve to be cared for. But tonight, his son slept safe in the next room. Tonight, an aircraft sat in a hangar being made whole again. Tonight, he had crossed back over the threshold he'd thought was permanently closed, found work that honored who he'd been without sacrificing who he needed to be. That was enough. More than enough. Garrett Hawthorne, father and consultant janitor, no more but never ashamed of having been one, closed his eyes and let exhaustion carry him toward sleep, toward tomorrow, toward whatever came next in a life that had suddenly remembered how to move forward. 3 weeks into the Hawthorne audit, Garrett had inspected 19 aircraft and documented 42 anomalies that ranged from minor maintenance oversights to critical safety concerns that required immediate grounding. He worked irregular hours, arriving at Sterling sometimes at dawn, when the hangar was quiet and empty, sometimes in late afternoon, after picking Cole up from school and bringing him along to witness what his father's expertise actually looked like in practice. Cole had taken to bringing his sketchpad settling into the corner of Garrett's small office, or finding a spot near whatever aircraft was being examined, drawing mechanical details with increasing accuracy, while his father crawled through wheel wells and traced hydraulic lines and documented patterns that told stories about stress and age and the inevitable decay of systems pushed beyond their designed limits. On this particular Thursday morning, Garrett stood beneath a Gulfstream G550 that Sterling leased to a tech CEO who flew twice weekly between Dallas and San Francisco. The main landing gear showed wear patterns that suggested misalignment in the strut assembly, nothing catastrophic, but enough to accelerate tire degradation and create unnecessary stress on components designed to absorb the violence of touchdown and rollout. Brendan Walsh crouched beside him, tablet in hand, but attention focused on what Garrett's flashlight revealed in the shadowed recesses of the gear mechanism. The alignment specs show within tolerance. How are you seeing a problem the measurement system says doesn't exist? Garrett pointed to 3 spots on the gear strut where paint had worn away in thin diagonal lines. These wear marks shouldn't be parallel. They should radiate from the pivot point in a fan pattern if the alignment was correct. The diagonal pattern means the gear is canting slightly under load, probably half a degree off true. Your measurement system checks static alignment. I'm looking at dynamic evidence. What happens when 8,000 pounds of force compresses this assembly during landing? Brendan took photos with his phone zoomed in on the wear marks, his expression showing the focused intensity of someone learning a language that had previously been invisible. So we need to re-rig the gear under simulated load conditions, not just measure it hanging free in the bay. Exactly. And check the trunnion bushings. If they're worn enough to allow that half degree of play, they need replacement before the misalignment damages the actuator. Movement near the hangar entrance drew Garrett's attention. Victoria Ashford walked across the concrete with purpose, her heels marking steady rhythm, her expression unreadable from this distance. She rarely came to the maintenance floor, preferred her windowed office and conference rooms where problems arrived pre-filtered through layers of management. Her presence here meant something had shifted in the corporate atmosphere. She stopped 10 feet away, waited for Garrett to finish his conversation with Brendan before speaking. Captain Hawthorne, my office, 20 minutes. She left without waiting for acknowledgement, her exit as abrupt as her arrival. Brendan looked at Garrett with an expression that mixed curiosity and concern. That didn't sound optional. It wasn't meant to. Finish documenting this gear issue. I want the full inspection report by end of day tomorrow. Garrett climbed out from under the aircraft, brushed dust from his jeans, walked to his office to retrieve his notebook and the preliminary audit findings he'd been compiling. Whatever Victoria wanted, it would require data and specificity. The ammunition he'd learned to carry into every conversation where his observations might be challenged or dismissed. Cole sat at the small desk, working through a math worksheet his teacher had assigned for extra credit. The boy looked up as Garrett entered. Boss lady looked serious. She usually does. I'll be back in 30 minutes. You okay here? Cole nodded, returned his attention to fractions and percentages. Garrett squeezed his shoulder once a brief connection that said more than words, then headed toward the administrative building. Victoria's office maintained its cathedral-like quality, vast and austere, designed to emphasize authority and minimize comfort. She stood at the windows overlooking the runways when Garrett entered her back to the door, her posture suggesting she was gathering thoughts or controlling emotions, or both. Close the door. Garrett complied, remained standing until she turned and gestured toward the chairs facing her desk. He sat. She took her own seat, opened a folder that contained printed reports and what looked like financial documents marked with red annotations. The board met yesterday. Emergency session. They reviewed your preliminary audit findings along with the repair cost estimates Russell provided. The number to bring our fleet up to your recommended safety standards is $7.2 million. Some of those board members think that's excessive. Think you're being overly cautious applying military-grade safety standards to civilian aircraft that operate in less demanding environments. Garrett kept his voice neutral, presenting facts without defensiveness. Military aircraft operate in combat environments with redundancy built into every critical system. Your civilian aircraft carry executives whose companies represent billions in market value, whose deaths would trigger lawsuits and investigations and regulatory scrutiny that would cost far more than $7 million in repairs. The safety standards I'm recommending aren't excessive. They're appropriate for the actual risk profile of your operation. Victoria pulled out several pages from the folder, spread them across her desk. Board member named Douglas Whitmore. He owns a private equity firm, sits on 4 corporate boards, thinks he understands operational risk because he's read executive summaries and quarterly reports. He wants to know why we should trust the judgment of someone who spent 6 months cleaning floors. His exact words were, "How do we know this isn't an overcorrection from someone who needs to justify his salary by finding problems that don't actually matter?" Garrett felt the familiar weight of credibility, questioned expertise, dismissed the endless requirement to prove value to people whose understanding ended at spreadsheet cells and cost-benefit ratios. What do you want from me? A defense of my qualifications, a justification for why safety margins matter. Or do you want me to dilute my recommendations until they're cheap enough that Whitmore doesn't have to defend a large expenditure to his investors? Victoria's expression flickered, showing something that might have been approval or might have been recognition of her own corporate exhaustion. I want you to present your findings to the board. Directly. No filters, no management summaries, no sanitized PowerPoint deck that reduces your work to bullet points. I want them to hear from you exactly what you found, why it matters, and what happens if we ignore it. When tomorrow, 2 p.m. conference room. 15 board members, most of them without technical backgrounds, all of them with opinions about risk and cost and the appropriate balance between safety and profitability. Garrett considered the battlefield being described the audience he'd need to reach the stakes that went beyond just his own credibility. I'll need to bring evidence. Photos, maintenance records, cost projections for what happens if we don't fix these issues versus what it costs to address them proactively. Russell will help you prepare, but Garrett understand what you're walking into. These people don't like being told they're wrong, don't like allocating resources to problems they didn't identify themselves. Whitmore especially will push back hard. He's been questioning my leadership for 2 years, sees this as an opportunity to undermine my authority by attacking yours. Then he's made a strategic error, because my authority doesn't come from your endorsement. It comes from 3,000 hours of flight time and 15 years of keeping machines from killing the people who trusted them. If he wants to challenge that, I'll welcome the conversation. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studied him, with an intensity that felt like assessment and curiosity competing for dominance. You're not intimidated by this. By facing down wealthy, powerful men who can end your employment with a phone call. I've faced machine failures at 30,000 feet, with no backup and no safety net. Wealthy men in conference rooms don't register on the same threat scale. A slight smile touched the corners of her mouth there and gone so quickly, Garrett almost missed it. Tomorrow at 2. Bring your evidence. Bring your confidence. And remember that at least one person in that room wants you to succeed. She returned her attention to the documents on her desk, the dismissal implicit. Garrett stood, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. Miss Ashford, why are you doing this? You could present the findings yourself, could insulate me from board politics, could let me do the technical work while you handle the institutional warfare. Victoria looked up, her expression showing something closer to vulnerability than he'd seen before. Because I'm tired of fighting alone. Because you represent something this company needs, and I can't provide credibility that comes from expertise rather than position. Because if the board dismisses you, they dismiss evidence that could save lives. And despite what people think about me, I do care whether people live or die in my aircraft. Garrett nodded, once left her to whatever battles she was preparing to fight, returned to the hangar where Cole was packing up his homework and Brendan was finishing the landing gear documentation. The next 24 hours blurred into preparation. Russell helped Garrett organize findings into a presentation that balanced technical detail with accessibility, creating visual evidence that board members without engineering backgrounds could understand while maintaining the precision needed to defend against expert challenge. They assembled photo evidence of every significant finding: the thermal stress patterns on valve housings, the misaligned landing gear, the corroded wiring bundles found in 3 separate aircraft, the hydraulic fluid contamination that suggested maintenance procedures weren't being followed consistently, the structural fatigue in a wing attachment point that was invisible to visual inspection but obvious to ultrasonic testing. Russell had compiled cost data that showed repair expenses versus potential liability costs if failures occurred during operation. The numbers were stark. $7.2 million to fix everything immediately versus projected costs in the hundreds of millions. If even one catastrophic failure resulted in passenger deaths or hull loss. Cole watched his father work late into Thursday evening, saw the intensity and focus that came when Garrett engaged fully with problems that mattered. At bedtime, the boy asked the question that had been building all day. Are they going to fire you? Garrett sat on the familiar edge of the familiar mattress, the ritual comfort of nighttime conversations. They might. If the board decides my recommendations cost too much, if they think I'm being overly cautious, if they choose profit over safety margins, it's possible. Would that be bad? Garrett considered how much truth a 9-year-old could carry, how much uncertainty children should have to navigate. It would be disappointing. I like this work, like feeling useful in ways that matter, but if they fire me, we'll be okay. I'll find other work. The skills I have don't disappear because one company doesn't want to pay for them. Cole nodded slowly, processing possibilities and outcomes with the seriousness of someone learning that adults didn't always have control over their circumstances. I think you should tell them the truth, even if they don't want to hear it, because that's what you taught me. Truth matters more than being liked. Garrett felt pride swell in his chest, overwhelming and pure, the kind of emotional response that came from witnessing your child internalize values you'd tried to model but feared might not translate. That's exactly right, buddy. Truth first. Everything else is negotiable. He kissed Cole's forehead, turned off the lamp, left the door cracked to its precise 3-inch opening. In the living room, he reviewed his notes one final time, memorizing key data points and cost figures and the logical progression of arguments he'd need to deploy if Whitmore or others challenged his conclusions. Sleep came fitfully interrupted by the mental rehearsal of tomorrow's confrontation and the weight of knowing that 15 people would judge not just his work, but his worth based on a single presentation in a room where he had no allies except Russell and maybe Victoria. Friday morning arrived gray and humid, Dallas weather-threatening storms that might or might not materialize. Garrett dropped Cole at school, returned to Sterling, spent 3 hours in the hangar, documenting one final aircraft before the board meeting demanded his attention. At 1:45 p.m., he changed from his work clothes into the same button-down shirt and clean jeans he'd worn to his first meeting with Victoria. Russell met him outside Conference Room A carrying a laptop and the presentation materials they'd prepared, ready as much as possible for something I can't fully predict. They entered the conference room together. 15 people occupied chairs around a massive oak table that probably cost more than Garrett's annual salary. Most were men in their 50s and 60s wearing suits that signaled wealth and position. 3 women sat interspersed among them, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her posture commanding despite being surrounded by people who technically had authority over her decisions. She gestured toward 2 empty chairs. Gentlemen, this is Captain Garrett Hawthorne, our senior flight safety consultant, and Dr. Russell Bennett, our chief engineer. They're here to present findings from the comprehensive fleet audit we commissioned 3 weeks ago. A man in his mid-60s with silver hair and a face that suggested he'd never heard an opinion he couldn't dismiss leaned forward. Douglas Whitmore Garrett assumed based on Victoria's description and the man's immediate aggressive posture. Before we begin, I'd like to understand Captain Hawthorne's qualifications. My research shows a significant employment gap. 7 years working as a janitor between military service and this current position. That raises questions about whether rust and outdated knowledge might be influencing these recommendations. Russell started to respond, but Garrett spoke first, his voice calm and level. Mr. Whitmore, during those 7 years, I maintained every aircraft in this fleet, not as a certificated mechanic, but as someone who cleaned them, observed them, documented anomalies that your maintenance systems missed or ignored. I filed 47 detailed technical reports during my tenure as a janitor. 15 of those reports predicted failures that later manifested as actual incidents. My knowledge isn't outdated. It's been continuously updated through daily contact with your aircraft while simultaneously watching your maintenance procedures fail to catch issues that a trained eye could identify. Whitmore's expression tightened, but he didn't interrupt. My qualifications include 3,840 hours of flight time in military and civilian aircraft, 15 years as a naval test pilot specializing in systems engineering and failure analysis, and direct involvement in the design and certification of the Gulfstream G650's hydraulic and flight control systems. The employment gap you reference represents a choice to prioritize my son over my career. That choice doesn't diminish my expertise. It demonstrates that I understand what actually matters when you're responsible for something more important than quarterly earnings. Silence settled over the room, thick and weighted. One of the women, younger than most board members, perhaps mid-40s, smiled slightly and leaned back in her chair with an expression that suggested she was enjoying Whitmore's discomfort. The elderly board member with distinguished bearing leaned forward, his weathered hands flat on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 4 decades building companies. Douglas. He looked directly at Whitmore. I've learned something in 40 years at these tables. The men who chase empires don't spend 7 years cleaning floors. The men who clean floors for 7 years are building something empires can't buy integrity. He paused, letting the words settle. Captain Hawthorne didn't come here to take our money. He came because the work mattered more than the title. That's the kind of man you bet your company on. Victoria spoke into the weighted silence that followed. Captain Hawthorne will walk you through the audit findings. I encourage questions, but let's see the complete picture before we debate individual points. Garrett opened the laptop Russell had prepared, advanced to the first slide, showing an overview of the inspection methodology and scope. For the next 40 minutes, he presented findings with clinical precision, showing photos and data. Explaining technical concepts in language accessible to non-engineers while maintaining enough detail to withstand expert scrutiny. He showed them the Sovereign 1 valve housing that had nearly killed Victoria, and 4 others, explained how thermal stress creates failure modes that digital sensors can't detect. Showed them the misaligned landing gear, the corroded wiring, the contaminated hydraulic fluid, the structural fatigue that was invisible until you knew where to look and how to interpret what you found. He presented cost data that Russell had compiled $7.2 million to address all findings, immediately phased over 6 months to minimize operational disruption. Then showed the alternative scenario actuarial data about catastrophic failure costs, hull loss expenses, liability projections, regulatory penalties, and the quantifiable damage to Sterling's reputation and market position. The numbers were devastating in their clarity. 7 million now, or potentially 300 million later, if probability curves played out according to historical accident data. Whitmore interrupted during the cost comparison slide. These projections assume worst-case scenarios. The likelihood of catastrophic failure is statistically minimal. We've operated for 15 years without a single hull loss or passenger fatality. Your recommendations seem designed to solve theoretical problems that may never manifest. Garrett advanced to the next slide, which showed a timeline of near misses and minor incidents that had occurred over Sterling's operational history. 12 events that could have resulted in catastrophic outcomes if conditions had been slightly different, if pilot skill had been marginally less, if weather or mechanical stress or simple bad luck had aligned differently. You're correct that catastrophic failure is statistically unlikely in any single flight. But you're operating a fleet of 37 aircraft, conducting approximately 4,200 flights annually. That's 4,200 opportunities for unlikely events to occur. The valve failure that nearly killed Miss Ashford 3 weeks ago had a predicted probability of approximately 3%. Low odds. But you were planning to fly anyway. Statistics become irrelevant when you're the person in the aircraft during that 3% event. Another board member, a man in his 50s with an engineer's bearing, spoke up. What's your confidence level in these findings? Are you certain all 42 anomalies represent genuine safety concerns, or could some be overcautious interpretations? Garrett met his gaze directly. I'm certain that all 42 findings represent deviations from optimal safety margins. Some are more critical than others, which is why I've categorized them into immediate, near-term, and long-term priorities. The $7 million estimate addresses immediate and near-term concerns. Long-term items can be handled through normal maintenance cycles over the next 18 months, but ignoring any of them increases your risk profile beyond what I consider acceptable for aircraft carrying passengers who trust you with their lives. The woman who'd smiled earlier raised her hand slightly. Captain Hawthorne, I'm Rebecca Stern, and I chair the audit committee. I've reviewed your preliminary reports, and I'm impressed by the detail and methodology. My question isn't about technical accuracy, it's about implementation. If we approve this expenditure, what's your confidence that our maintenance teams can actually execute the repairs to the standard you require? That's the crucial question. I've observed your maintenance procedures for 6 months. Your technicians are skilled, but they're working within protocols that prioritize efficiency and cost control over thoroughness. To implement these repairs effectively, you need procedural changes alongside the physical work. I've drafted new inspection protocols and training programs that Dr. Bennett and I can implement over the same 6-month period. The $7 million covers parts and labor. The procedural changes cost nothing except time and institutional willingness to do things differently. Rebecca nodded, made notes on the tablet in front of her. Whitmore wasn't finished. Let me be direct, Captain. This feels like empire building. You're relatively new to this position. You need to justify your salary and your role, so you're finding problems that require expensive solutions and ongoing oversight that conveniently keeps you employed. How do we know these aren't manufactured crises designed to make you indispensable? Garrett closed the laptop, set it aside, looked at Whitmore with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced more dangerous challenges than corporate politics. Mr. Whitmore, I have a 9-year-old son and exactly 0 interest in empire building. I took this position because Victoria Ashford offered me work that uses my skills to keep people safe. If you decide my recommendations are too expensive or too cautious, fire me. I'll find other work, but understand clearly, I'm not manufacturing crises. I'm documenting failures that already exist and that will eventually manifest whether you acknowledge them or not. You can spend $7 million now to fix them proactively, or you can wait until one of your aircraft experiences catastrophic failure and spend 50 times that amount defending lawsuits and managing regulatory fallout. Your choice. But don't pretend the choice is between safety and economy. It's between expensive prevention and catastrophically expensive reaction. The room fell silent again. Victoria's expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed something that might have been satisfaction or vindication. Another board member, elderly and distinguished with the bearing of old money, spoke for the first time. I've been on this board since Victoria's father founded Sterling. I've seen 3 different safety regimes, watched us evolve from a small charter operation to a major player in executive aviation. Captain Hawthorne's presentation reminds me of conversations we had 30 years ago when we were deciding whether to invest in safety beyond regulatory minimums. We chose to invest, and that choice built Sterling's reputation for reliability. I move that we approve the full $7.2 million expenditure and implement Captain Hawthorne's recommended protocols. Rebecca Stern spoke immediately. I second the motion. We should vote. Victoria called the vote. 12 board members approved the expenditure and procedural changes. 2 abstained. Douglas Whitmore voted against his expression, showing barely contained anger at losing control of the narrative. The motion carries. Captain Hawthorne, Dr. Bennett, you have authorization to proceed. I want monthly progress reports and immediate notification if you discover anything that requires grounding aircraft or accelerating timelines. The meeting concluded with handshakes and brief conversations. Several board members approached Garrett to ask technical questions or express appreciation for the thoroughness of his work. Rebecca Stern lingered after others had departed. Captain, I'd like your permission to share your presentation with the audit committees of 3 other companies where I serve as a board member. Your methodology for identifying analog failures that digital systems miss could benefit the entire industry. Garrett glanced at Victoria, who nodded slightly. You have my permission. If it prevents accidents elsewhere, I'm happy to contribute. Rebecca left, followed by the last of the board members, except Whitmore, who approached Victoria with an expression that promised conflict. This isn't over. I'll be watching every dollar spent on this project, and if results don't justify the expenditure, I'll call for a full review of your management decisions. Victoria's voice remained calm, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Douglas, you voted against preventing aircraft failures that could kill passengers. That's on record now. If anything goes wrong with our fleet, if we have an incident that this audit could have prevented your liability exposure, will be substantial. I'd be very careful about the positions you take from this point forward. Whitmore left without responding, his exit marked by the heavy conference room door closing with excessive force. Victoria turned to Garrett and Russell. That went better than I expected. Garrett, you handled Whitmore perfectly. Didn't get defensive, didn't escalate, just presented facts and let him expose his own agenda. Garrett began packing the laptop and presentation materials. He's scared. Scared that you're more competent than he is scared that his understanding of risk is superficial. Scared that people are starting to notice. Scared people attack. It's predictable. Victoria walked to the windows overlooking the runways, watched a Gulfstream taxi toward departure. My father built this company on 2 principles: safety first, and surround yourself with people who know more than you do. I've sometimes forgotten that second principle, gotten caught up in proving I could do everything myself. You reminded me why expertise matters, why listening to people who actually know things is more valuable than surrounding yourself with yes men who validate your existing beliefs. She turned back to face them. Thank you both. For the work, for the presentation, for standing up to Whitmore's bullying. Now go execute this plan. Make our aircraft as safe as you promised they could be. Garrett and Russell left together, walked back toward the hangar in comfortable silence. As they reached the maintenance floor, Russell spoke. You made an enemy today. Whitmore will look for opportunities to undermine you. Garrett shrugged. I've had enemies before. Aircraft that were trying to kill me, systems that wanted to fail at the worst possible moment, commanders who thought my methods were unorthodox. Whitmore is just another obstacle. I'll navigate around him the same way I navigated around everything else that tried to stop me from doing necessary work. His phone buzzed. A text from Cole's school reminder about the science fair next Thursday, where Cole would be presenting his project on hydraulic systems and aircraft landing gear. Garrett smiled, the corporate warfare immediately contextualized by the reminder of what actually mattered. I need to pick up my son. Tomorrow we start implementing the safety protocols. Tonight I help with science fair preparation. Russell watched him walk away toward the small office where Cole was probably already waiting toward the life Garrett had carefully constructed around priorities that made sense to him even when they seemed inexplicable to others. The next 3 months unfolded in methodical progression. Garrett and Russell worked with maintenance teams to implement new inspection protocols, training technicians to recognize analog indicators that sensors missed. Aircraft rotated through maintenance cycles where critical systems were upgraded or replaced according to the audit priorities. Cole became a familiar presence in the hangar, arriving after school several days each week, observing his father's work, asking questions that Garrett answered with the same careful detail he applied to training engineers. The boy's understanding of aircraft systems deepened his sketches, becoming more technically accurate, his confidence growing as he realized his father's expertise commanded genuine respect from people whose opinions mattered. Brendan Walsh emerged as Garrett's most dedicated student, spending voluntary hours learning to interpret vibration patterns and thermal stress signatures, developing instincts that complemented his MIT education with practical wisdom earned through observation and attention. Victoria stopped by the hangar, occasionally never staying long, usually just checking progress or asking brief questions about findings or timelines. But her presence felt different than before. Less about authority assertion and more about genuine interest in work that mattered to her beyond quarterly earnings. 3 months and 4 days after the board meeting, Garrett sat in his office completing the final audit report. All immediate and near-term safety concerns had been addressed. The fleet was measurably safer, maintenance protocols were substantially improved, and the safety culture at Sterling had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Russell appeared in the doorway. Board meeting in 20 minutes. Victoria wants you there to present the final report and close out the audit. Garrett saved his work, closed his laptop, followed Russell back to conference room A, where most of the same board members were assembled. Douglas Whitmore's seat was conspicuously empty. Victoria noticed Garrett's glance toward the vacant chair. Douglas resigned from the board last week. Difference of opinion about company direction. She paused, then added quietly, "He told me I was making a mistake trusting you over proven engineers. I told him the only mistake was not listening sooner." Rebecca Stern assumed his committee positions. The final presentation took 30 minutes. Garrett walked them through completed work, documented improvements, and safety margins showed before and after data that quantified risk reduction. The numbers were comprehensive and undeniable. Sterling's fleet was substantially safer now than 3 months ago, and the organizational knowledge about how to maintain that safety had been institutionalized through training and procedural changes. Rebecca Stern spoke first when Garrett finished. "Captain, on behalf of the board, thank you. This audit exceeded our expectations in scope, quality, and impact. Your work potentially saved lives we'll never know about, prevented disasters that will never happen because you identified and fixed problems before they manifested. That's the highest form of expertise." Other board members offered similar appreciation. The meeting concluded with handshakes and expressions of gratitude. Several board members approached Garrett personally, Rebecca Stern asking permission to share his methodology, the elderly member shaking his hand firmly and saying simply, "Thank you for your service, Captain." As the room emptied, Victoria gestured for Garrett to remain. When they were alone, she pulled an envelope from her folder. The board authorized a completion bonus for the audit. $25,000. You earned it several times over. Garrett accepted the envelope, felt the weight of security it represented, the breathing room it would provide. Thank you. This means college savings for Cole, maybe a reliable vehicle that doesn't require constant patching. Victoria's expression softened in ways that suggested she was permitting herself to show something normally kept hidden. I've been thinking about your situation. Single father, brilliant engineer, working part-time to accommodate your son's needs. It's admirable, but it's also limiting. Have you considered what happens when Cole is older? When he doesn't need you? Present every afternoon, Garrett met her gaze, uncertain where this was leading. I've considered it, but that's 9 years away. I don't plan that far ahead anymore. Too many variables, too much unpredictability. 9 years isn't that long. And when it arrives, I'd like Sterling to be where you build the next phase of your career. Full-time role, your own department authority to implement safety protocols across the aviation industry beyond just our fleet. I'm not offering that today. Cole still needs you, but when the time comes, the offer will be waiting. Garrett absorbed this, the strange sensation of being valued enough that someone was planning his future without requiring him to compromise his present. I appreciate that. More than you probably realize. Victoria nodded, released his hand, gathered her materials. They left the conference room together, their footsteps echoing through corridors that no longer felt like foreign territory to Garrett, parting ways at the junction where executive space met operational floor. Garrett returned to his office where Cole sat reading a book about aerospace engineering written for young adults. The boy looked up, registered his father's expression, smiled. Good meeting, very good meeting. Come on, let's go celebrate. They drove to Cole's favorite restaurant, nothing fancy, just burgers and milkshakes, and the comfortable rhythm of father and son who'd weathered uncertainty together and come through stronger. Over dinner, Garrett explained the bonus, asked Cole what he thought they should do with the money. College fund, and maybe fix the truck properly instead of just patching it every month. Garrett felt pride surge through him, the kind that came from raising someone who understood priorities and didn't demand more than was reasonable. That's exactly what we'll do. College fund, first truck second, maybe a weekend trip somewhere this summer. Nothing extravagant, but more than we've had lately. Cole nodded, took a large bite of his burger, chewed thoughtfully. Dad, I'm proud of you. For not giving up when people didn't listen. For being right even when it was hard. For teaching me that doing the right thing matters more than being comfortable. Garrett reached across the table, squeezed his son's shoulder. I'm proud of you too, buddy. For being patient while I figured out how to be both a good father and a good employee. For understanding why I made the choices I made. For becoming the kind of person who values truth and integrity over convenience. They finished dinner, drove home through Dallas, evening traffic, settled into their apartment with the comfortable ease of people who'd built a life together through intentional choices and mutual respect. At bedtime, Cole asked one final question before sleep claimed him. Are we going to be okay? Like long-term? Okay. Garrett sat on the edge of the bed, the ritual comfort of these moments never diminishing despite years of repetition. We're going to be better than okay. We have stability. We have security. We have work that matters and people who appreciate it. Most importantly, we have each other. That's the foundation everything else builds on. Cole's eyes drifted closed, his breathing deepening into sleep's rhythm. Garrett watched him for several minutes, memorizing this moment the way he'd memorized hundreds of others, building a library of nights when the world was right and the choices made sense and the future felt manageable rather than overwhelming. In the living room, Garrett opened his laptop, composed a brief email to Russell outlining thoughts about long-term safety protocol improvements. Sent another email to Rebecca Stern, thanking her for the board's confidence and offering to consult on similar audits for the other companies where she served. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, sent at 9:47 p.m. unusual timing, but the message's tone was pure Victoria, direct-controlled, but allowing a sliver of something deeper. The board asked why I trust your judgment over engineers with MIT degrees. I told them because you don't need my approval to know you're right. You trust the work, not the validation. That's rare. 3 weeks ago, you saved my life. Tonight, you saved my company. Thank you. Garrett read the message twice, felt the weight of what she wasn't saying beneath what she had. He typed a brief response. You created space for the work to matter. That took courage most CEOs don't have. Thank you for listening when it counted. He set down his phone, closed his laptop, walked to the window overlooking the Dallas skyline. Out there in the darkness, Sterling Aerospace's fleet moved through the night sky, carrying passengers who would never know his name, never know the janitor who'd saved their lives. That was fine. Cole knew. Victoria knew. Russell knew. The people who mattered understood. His phone sat on the table behind him, Victoria's message still glowing. A job offer waiting 9 years in the future. A promise of what could be when Cole no longer needed him here every afternoon. But that was then. Tonight was now. He walked to Cole's bedroom, stood in the doorway, watching his son sleep. The door cracked exactly 3 inches, the way it had been every night for 7 years. The boy's breathing steady and sure. This moment, this quiet, this choice he'd made 7 years ago and would make again tomorrow. This was what winning looked like. Not the board approval or the bonus or the title, not the vindication or the respect or the future promises. Just this, a father standing in a doorway, watching his son dream, knowing he'd chosen right. Garrett Hawthorne father first, and everything else second, turned off the hall light and let the darkness carry him toward tomorrow.